Hi everyone, welcome to Mamsu Code video guide session. In the previous video, we completed our storage broker and for the select all method. So this is turning green, and the other broker that we will be requiring when we enter our validation layer or handling any exceptions, logging broker, which is already covered as part of the create workflow. So we don't have to worry about that in read all workflow. The next one that we're going to work on in this video is the foundations. So the naming convention here is retrieve all. I will share a link in the description which talks about what is the naming convention that we'll have to follow when we are at the broker layer, when we are at the services layer, and when we are at the exposure layer. So for now, this is something that we're going to work on. Let's get coding. Okay, so first thing, let me get to main, get the latest. Okay. And this is the code that we wrote in the last video, right? On the broker. So let's create a new PR for the foundation. So users, tree, and this is going to be foundations. And the operation is going to be retrieve all. And the entity that we're working on is sample. Or we can say sample. So any meaningful name on the branch that we're working on, right? So create it. Okay. So let's open up our services. And this is going to be a test-driven approach, right? So we're going to first write a failing test and then go with our pass test. So let's go implement what this code is going to do. So the first thing is the contract, right? So what is this going to return? It's going to return list of sample. Solve this. And the method name here is retrieve all samples. There's no parameter, right? It's not going to perform any retrieve activity on a specific input parameter. So this is blank. It's going to retrieve all by default. This is our contract. We are good here. Let's get to the implementation. So yeah, I was waiting for this to turn green. It did. So let's do control and dot, implement the interface. Yeah, so this is a single line. Let's scope it out here. So now we have our basic framework ready to write a failing test. Let's open up our unit test. So we need a new file because this is working on the logic add. Now we are going to work on retrieval. So let's say sample service test dot logic dot retrieve all dot cs. Okay. Why is this red? Because it's missing the partial modifier. So we are saying a partial, and now comes the test, right? So this is going to be a fact, and then public void. Let's resolve this. Okay. What is the test name? It should do something. What it should do? It should retrieve all samples. That's the activity that we are testing. So coming to our template here, given, when, then. Okay, let's clean up a little bit. So Control KE was the shortcut. Otherwise, if you run the code cleanup, everything is going to be cleaned up. Okay, so now coming to our, the code that we are going to test. We're going to test for the service, right? So this dot sample service, and we're going to say this time it's not add, right? So it's retrieve all. What are we going to test? I'm going to call the service. It's going to be returning something, and I'm going to check if that return is being valid or not. So I need to store that return so that I can validate it against to the data that I'm preparing. So here I have to say list of sample. That's the return type for the method, right? So let's resolve this one here, and then this is going to be actual samples, as this is getting into extended belly pattern, right? Okay, so now we have said this. But what is this method going to do internally? Is this method going to give back what it owns? Not really, right? It's actually going to connect to the broker and then going to return back what the broker is going to return. So we need to mimic that. Okay, So what are we saying here? A list of sample random samples equal create random samples. So this we are preparing a test data, right? So we don't have this method yet. So let's get inside this. So we're still going to leverage the filler, but instead of this create, what does this create do? It's just going to create one instance. So that's why we have our return type as just one entity. But this time we want, more than one entity, right? So what are we going to say is private static list of sample. Let's resolve this. And the method that we are going to call is create random samples. And here we're going to still call the create filler method, but this time we're going to say we're going to use an overload method. So it says create multiple filled objects. So it's going to take an account, right? So let's do this. Count, we're parameter aliasing because the value that we're going to pass in is not exactly going to be matching with the count variable. But what are we going to pass? Are we going to do this? Let's complete code here. Okay, let's see what the error is. So it says it cannot convert. So we need to say to list so that it will be able to convert the code into the data that is returning to something that is what required. So system link, yeah. Okay, now coming back to this question, do we want just one entity? If it is just one, then we can still leverage this, right? But just that, the list is going to have just one entity. But then remember the concept that we had on this logic. We don't want our input data to always be 1, 2, 3, right? We purely want every single time a random value to be tested. So in that case, what we want to do is get some random value. So let's put that code into a method, get random number, so that every single time we have 2 sample records or 3 or 10 or 20, right? Whatnot. So we're going to define that get random method. So I'm going to say private static, and this random method is going to return me an integer. And then I say get random number. Okay. How is this going to help us out? As we are leveraging the dynamics object filler, what we have here is new, and we can say int range. So this is, yeah, and we can come and say, so let's read what are the options that we have. So it says maximum, initialize a new instance of the int range class to a maximum. So I think here, if you're saying a maximum of 10, it's going to come and say, oh, you can have random of 10, right? First time it might give 1, next time it might give you 10, and then it can give you 2, whatnot. Truly random value for the max limit that you're saying. Is that sufficient for us? We don't want it to be, ending up in 1, right? We truly want to have a list. Let's get into the other constructor which says min and max. So this might be helpful for us to say, hey, give me something, a minimum of 2, so I can really test that this is a collection, and then a maximum of some value, right? So min, since this is an integer again, which is not matching the parameter name, we are going to parameter alias. So here I'm going to say 2, and max, you can take account of it, how efficient you want. You can still go ahead and give a million records. Is that going to scale for the testing? So you can ballpark a number that is reasonable for you to test. So I'm picking up 10. And then this one is going to be get value. So this particular syntax is going to generate an integer between 2 and 10 every single time when you call this method, so that we are preparing the random set of data for the numbers that we are going to pass in. Okay, let's get here. Maybe we can test it out, right? That's how we learn better. So right click and debug test. So I'm going to over this random samples and see how many records is it creating. So this time it has created 9. Okay, let me stop, right click and debug. Let's see, 4. Good. So this is what we wanted. Okay, then now our focus is to set up something on our broker, which is going to return you the data that you are going to say, hey, if someone going to call you, please return this. So I'm going to say list of sample, and then let's go with the variable name sample and then come back and say what's the meaningful name that we can give, right? So we want to do this so that we generally have a better way, right? That's the same thing we did here. We did not just say random sample and pass that random. We are building our story. So we are saying that this method is being passed for an input. Whenever the storage broker is calling with an input sample, it returns a persisted sample, right? So same thing we can do here. So we can say persisted, and we can go with plural as this is list, right? And now we can go ahead and mock our broker. So this is going to be our storage broker setup. And what is the method that we have to ensure? This time, if you call insert, it's not going to work because the workflow is expecting to retrieve and the service is expected to call the select all samples broker method to return the data. So here we are. It's trying to autocomplete. Let me tab it out. So it says that this storage broker is going to return this value whenever this method is getting called. Okay, let me remove this. So we have prepared it. Now we have to validate. So we have the variable which is returning, but we have to validate it against something, right? So let's get here and say, what's my expected samples? And I'm going to do persisted samples dot deep clone. Hope you remember why we are doing deep clone. If it's new to you or if you forgot what's happening, get to the logic add happy path fail test where we have talked about deep clone and how to test it out and all those things. Okay, so let's come and validate the data. So we say should be equivalent to expected sample. Let's resolve this one. Okay, then dependency calls, right? So this dot storage broker mock dot verify, and the broker method that you're expected to call is this, and exactly 1 time, not more than that. Okay, let's resolve this. Not just this, right? We're going to go to the next level dot VNO, so that what if this workflow calls insert? Why is it? It's not even necessary. That's something that we are verifying. And then it should also not call the logging broker because this is an happy path. We don't want to log anything for the current use case. So we're going to do that. So let's run this test. Any guesses on what would be the message? Yeah, it's going to be not implemented exception. Perfect. So let's analyze, run code cleanup. Let's take this test method and then go ahead and say this is a failed test case. Perfect. Now let's go write the happy path, make it pass, let's make it happy. So here we are. So what were we going to say? This dot storage broker dot select all samples. That's the only thing that it's expecting, right? So let's right click and run. It says it's passed because I'm expecting whenever you call this, I have to get some value, and that should be same what the storage broker returns. I'm not tampering the data. So let's get this here and go here and make it pass. Okay, so I think now it's getting easy, right? Last time logic add, we actually did it in twofold. One is a fail test in a separate video and a pass test in a separate video because there were a lot of new concepts that you were trying to learn. But now you have all become a pro on understanding how to write a test case, how to set it up, how to verify, how to truly create random deep clone, right? That's why we went fast in this video. So if you still need a recap, feel free to go there and then, take it slowly. Okay, so what is the next set of test cases that we will be writing? If we take a reference for the ad, we went ahead and did validations, right? And what did we perform the validations for? On the input parameter. So in this retrieve all, we don't have any input parameter. So that means good news, we can skip the validations. What's the next set of test cases that we had to write? So we went with our exceptions. And again, there's going to be some good news here. So you can make the research for what it's going to throw an exception, right? So let's get here. So here, this is purely nothing, right? It's just returning. If at all you see any valid exceptions that we need to capture, we can still go ahead and do it. For now, we're going to just handle our service exception, which says any error that occurs in the system, I'm going to hold it and validate it. I'm going to hold it, wrap it up in a meaningful exception, and then throw it back. So exceptions dot retrieve all dot cs. Okay. Partial class, control ke, and now comes my test. Control and dot. I've seen a practice where we can copy paste code. My humble request or recommendation, if you're going to learn, it's better you write the code, maybe write it 50 times, 100 times until it's like you keep talking to something or you multitask and then you just write your code out of your mind, right? Until you really know the sense of every single line that you're writing, do not copy paste. And that's the best way that you can learn. So here we are. And then this is going to be public void. So what are we expecting? It should do something. What it should do? It should throw service exception on what? On retrieve all. When should it do that? If service error occurs. Not just that, right? It should capture the error and do something and log. That's our test. Okay. And the sections that we are going to focus on is given, when, and then. Okay. Now, what are we trying to do? It's going to be an exception. So here we are at the action. Retrieve all action. And then I'm going to defer the execution to say this dot sample service dot retrieve all. Let's resolve this system. Okay. And now what I want to do is throw the exception, right? We're going to test that, assuming that this exception is actually occurring and being thrown. So we need to prepare that. So what I'm going to say is var service exception equal new exception, any generic exception, right? And remember our localization and categorization, how we did in the ad, we captured the service exception and wrapped it under our localized exception. And then, categorized it to the outer exception. That's our entity service exception, right? Again, good news, all these exceptions are created. So we don't have to create, we will just use them. So var fail sample service exception, new fail sample service exception. We will see automatically detected, right? But we need to pass this. So let's say one that I'm passing. Now our outer, that's going to be a expected sample service exception equal new sample service exception of what? Failed sample service exception. And now we're going to throw the exception so that the exception actually occurs, right? That's how we can test it. So we're going to throw it from our dependency and say broker dot, and the method that we are going to use to throw in this workflow, if you use insert, it will never be called. So the exception cannot be thrown. So we're going to throw it from the actual dependency method that's going to be called in this workflow. So I'm not going to use the autocomplete. Let me tab and say throws service exception. So now I have prepared everything that's needed for me to actually throw the error and validate from this particular variable. So let's get here. What are we going to do? We're going to assert. We're going to assert if the error is thrown. Throws sample service exception. And against what? Against this variable. Okay. Then what are we doing here is the dependency call. So storage broker, verify broker, and the method is select all, and it should be called exactly once. Okay. Not just that, we are expecting the system to log. So this dot logging broker dot verify broker, and then the method that I'm expecting is log error. And I'm going to validate exactly the exception layers also, right? So this it is same exception as, and then, oh, I'm typing sample, right? Same exception as and what? Expect. This one should be called exactly once, right? We are wrapping up our test with our verify no other calls. So this dot logging broker dot verify no other. Okay, so we have prepared the data that the exception should be thrown, and we are calling the service. We are validating if that particular call is throwing this exception. And then we're validating a dependency that this should be called once because the exception is called, right? And the order of execution itself. So first this is called because the exception is thrown, only then the logging broker is called to log the error. So that's why the order here is for one, and this one comes in the second. In the same order, we are validating the no other calls. Okay, let's right click and run the test. So any guesses again, what except message that it will be having? I'm guessing it to be no exception thrown. Oh, sorry, system exception, right? Because that's what is getting thrown. My bad. Okay, so expected is I'm expecting the outer, but then this system.exception is only thrown. Okay, let's analyze, run, code cleanup, and then take this test method. And then I'm going to say this is a failed test case. Commit it. Cool. Now we'll just make it pass, and then we're done with this particular layer. We are good to go create the PR. So here we are. So we need to prepare our similar to this, right? Try catch, have the method inside this, and then go write the code. So this can be try catch, and I'm going to have this one here, right? I need to have return, and this needs to be in the curly braces. So let's go and make it a two-liner, right? This needs a set. Okay, so we need to go write this try catch. So this contract and this contract is different, right? Because this one is expecting a sample, but this one is expecting list of sample. So let's go write it in our exceptions class. It's going to be of similar sort. So let me minimize everything here. So here what I'm going to say is private delegate, and the contract for this delegate method is going to be list of sample. List. And then this is going to be returning samples function, right? And then let me write it after this. So private list of sample, and this is going to be my try catch. And then what I'm going to have here is the return sample function, right? And then the actual try catch. So let's write this one here and then come back. So this is going to be returning samples function. And this is return, right? Return. And the exception that I'm going to catch is this. A exception. I'm not just going to throw it. What I'm going to do is wrap it up, right? So var failed sample service exception, and be new failed sample. Okay, and I'm going to throw what? Wrap this one up in the service exception, right? Since we have written this method, now actually you're seeing the impact of moving the code into a method, right? We are going to leverage that one here. So we're going to say create and log service exception of my fail service, right? So that's the simple code here. And if we come here, the error is gone. Let's see if this satisfies our need for the test. So right click and run. Yeah, it's passed. So what did we do? Nothing much. It's very simple what we did previously, right? We went and added a try catch. We went to the exception and we created a delegate method. The contract is this. And then we said it's going to try to execute the code. If there's an error, it's going to wrap it up and then it's going to throw with the categorized exception. So analyze, run, code cleanup. Let me grab the test method here. And I'm going to say this is a pass. Cool. So successfully, we have completed our foundation layer. In the next video, let's go write our exposure layer where we can retrieve all the data that we have saved in the system. Thank you for watching.